Hi, I'm Jesper Pedersen from QTopia. In this video series on Qt and QML, we now made it to discuss how do we set up our components so that they work out of the box. We saw in the previous video that we could create our components simply by taking some QML code, put it into a file of its own, add some properties, add some signals perhaps, add some methods to that element that we have in there. But one thing that is really hard to learn by yourself is how do I make my component size correctly? What do I do so that when I take my component and I put it into a row, into a column, into a grid, we haven't talked about any of those three, but we will soon. If I put it into any of those, that it will have a reasonable size. That's what we're going to talk about in this video. I'm going to show you a very weird example. It's not like a real user interface, but it will show you a number of corner cases. And hopefully at the end of these 20 minutes, you will have a good grasp on how do I create my components. So let's start looking at the code. When you approach your new code base, you need a strategy for how do I actually read this code base. And my strategy, at least, is I'll go over here in the site and I will collapse all the elements that I have. There we are. So now I only see the topmost. We have an item. It's 800 by 600. There is a row, there is a rectangle, and there's a row. And fortunately, they have been given good IDs. I would actually recommend that even if you do not need to reference some element from another element, still give it an ID because it will help you understand your code better. Let's run it so that I can point to the code or to the screen as we read the code. So the first row, let's expand that one here. The first row, and a row, we haven't talked about row, but it's you can almost hear it. It's a layout manager kind of thing where its children are laid out in a row, so next to each other. It anchors itself, so even though it lays out its children, itself needs to be laid out somehow, so it anchors itself to the parent's top. So this row that we see over here is anchored to the top of the element, and its horizontal center is aligned with the parent's horizontal center. That's the line that goes down here. There's spacing of 20, that's the 20 pixels that you can see in between here. Then I got a button that has a width 300 and the text open. You see open, and I'll bet you if you measure, there will be 300 pixels right here. And similarly, I got a button called close and another 300. So that's the first row that we already understood there. We'll get back to the button. What does that class look like? That's the whole thing in this video here, to mess with that component that's our button. But we'll get back to that once we understood the other two children of our item. So that's the first one. Here's the second one. The second one is a rectangle. It has the light steel blue color. That's the color that you see here. It anchors itself, so to the bottom of that row up here, and the bottom is the top of that row down here. When we talk about anchoring, you can even anchor to things that is described later in the file. We might not have talked about that when we talked about the anchoring, but the anchor, just as anything else in QML, doesn't depend on where it is in the file to be able to reference those things. And the left is the parent left and the right is the parent right. So that's basically placing this blue underneath that row and above that row and glue to both of the sides of the screen. Now I got a button here. That button has the text test. Its height is 100 pixels. It is anchored to the left of the screen, and its vertical center is aligned with the vertical center of the parent. I got a rectangle. The rectangle is red. You see that here. It has a width of 15 pixels. Its height is the same height as the button, and it is anchored to the right side of the button. So you can see the left side of this rectangle is glued to the right side of the button. And finally, its vertical center is aligned with the vertical center of the button. The last part, the row at the bottom, is again a row. It anchors itself to the bottom of the screen, so it glues itself to the bottom of the screen. Its horizontal center is aligned with the horizontal center of the parent. There is 20 pixels of spacing, and I got 2 buttons with the text OK and cancel. Let's go look at the button now. So we've seen the button in use in many different situations now. We have 5 buttons here. Some of them specify a width, some of them specify a height, some of them doesn't even specify a width or a height. So to be able to work at all, the button must tell its parent how much size it would like. And that's what we see in the code here. So my button at the top is just an item. Inside there, I got a border image. We talked about a border image in the video on images. There's a link just below in case you want to see that one. But the border image is basically this thing that you can stretch. And when you stretch it, we have the 4 corners and that will not be changed. Then we got the bars here that will be stretched in this direction, and the horizontal lines that will be stretched in this direction, and the center in the center of the image. We got a border image, and we specify the left border and the right border to be root.margin, and margin is this variable that we have up here, property that is 35 pixels. So 35 pixels from the left, 35 pixels from the right. That is where I cut my border image. The image itself is this button.png. We can look at what that looks like. Images, button.png. It looks like this. I can zoom in a bit so you can see it better. It's not very interesting. The key thing is that we are cutting it down right along this line here. If I could do it straight down and along this line that starts up here then and end down there. That is our source of this button. Inside the button we have the text, and the text is a property alias from the text that I give from outside. It is 30 pixels big, and it anchors itself inside of the parent. Remember, I'm using the button without specifying width and height on the button, so it must itself come up with a reasonable size. We touched on that subject a few videos ago. It is called implicit width and implicit height. What it says here is that, hey, if there is no other, if from the outside it doesn't come and tell me the width, then I think that a good size for me would be the width of the label, so the text down here. Let's see if we have it running here. So a button that has a long text will be wider than a button with a short text, plus the margin. So that's this rounding of that button here that I have. So there we are, my margin times 2, because I have the 35 pixels on one side and 35 pixel on the other side. So that's the implicit width. And the implicit height, well, my border image, that's the image that I have there, whatever height it has, that seems to be a good one. So I'll just take that as my implicit height. Okay, that's the example. And it works, as you can see, perfectly well. I'm going to break that example in all the ways that I can possibly think of, because that will teach you, or you will see what is the effect. So whenever you see that effect, then you can do the reverse engineering and say, okay, it must have been broken in that way or the other. But first, before we do that, let me just press a magic key button here on my keyboard. I have bound my key Control-Shift-G to start up GammaRay. GammaRay is a tool that you can download from Qt. So just Google Qt GammaRay and you'll land straight on the download page. It's an open source tool that is specialized in Qt. The cool thing about GammaRay is that it knows enormous amount of information about your Qt application. So remember, we saw that the elements are ordered with parent elements and child elements and grandchildren and so on. That order you can see in GammaRay. You can see where things are located in the UI and so on and so on. So GammaRay is a really, really useful tool. I'll bet you that everybody who knows about GammaRay, they will be using it at least a few times a week, if not more, when they are developing a Qt application. So I'm starting up GammaRay here, and you can already see that it loads in the application. So what you see here is actually part, let me just zoom it a bit out. You'll recognize the application that we're working on here. It pre-selected quick scenes for me, which is where I will be able to look at the scenes of my QML application. And it's a bit rough here in size, but that's something I did to make it possible for you to watch this video on your phone. Typical GammaRay will be a reasonable size, so don't worry about that. But what we see in here in GammaRay is that if I choose this tool here, which is my picker, I can click on elements and see if I click on this one here, you can see my width, or you can see all the properties of that element. And there's a lot of properties that you usually wouldn't know about or you usually wouldn't care about, but we definitely have one interesting property that we'll be looking at here, the width. You can see this button over here is 300 pixel in width. Its height is 72 pixel. Its position, the X value here is position 0. And position 0, well, let's see. It's the background that I chose, and that background is inside its parent. So if I go over here, I can see that, hey, the whole button here. Now that one is highlighted here, and again, its position is 320. So GammaRay, really a useful tool when you're sitting there and fighting position. And I'll start it up a few times in the following minutes when I'm crippling our application. Okay, let's start out with the first crippling of the application. Let me just go here and say, well, implicit width, implicit height, I forgot to create those. So this is the setup where you start your component and you don't think about the implicit width and implicit height. And here is what you will see. Remember, before I started up, just think for a second, what would it look like? Well, there's definitely a bunch of places where I have the button where I do not specify a width or a height. Give me your best guess. What is the default value for width and height? Yes, of course, it's 42. No, it's 0. So when I run it here now, you will see that my application looks really weird. There's no buttons up here. That's not the button sitting there. There's some text down here, but what's that all about? Well, start your GammaRay, and if you do not have that magic key binding that I do in my Qt Creator, then it's just a GammaRay and QML scene, and then your application. First of all, you can see over here the parent-child relationship tree that we had. Let's just go down and figure out what is that text. Let me just zoom out of it. Oh, let me zoom just a wee bit. I can't. Okay. Anyway, what is this text that we see down here? What is that about? And I can choose the picker tool and see if I can hit that. No, I can't. Okay, fair enough. Quick text. I can pick it there. Let me zoom in so we can see what is going on here. You can just pick it again. There we are. You can actually see that the outline of that text, the bounding rectangle of that text, you can see that highlighted here with GammaRay. And you can see part of it is actually standing outside of the visible area. And why is that? Well, let's go back and look at the source code and look at this particular button that we had there. Main.qml, it was the button row. That's where we had the two buttons without any width or height specified. So the button that stands down there, given that I don't specify implicit width and implicit height, is now 0 pixels in height. The row that it's in will place them at that position. They are 0 in width and 0 in height, meaning both buttons stands at the same position there. You don't see the buttons themselves. We go and look at the button here, the class for the button. You can see that the border image, that is the colors that makes up the button. That one is anchor fill parent. Anchor fill parent, when the parent is 0 by 0 pixels, that's going to be nothing. But the text down here is center in parent, and the text itself will have an implicit width and an implicit height that is the width and the height of the text. So that one will be centered in the parent, but the parent is 0 pixels high and it's anchored to the bottom. So it will be standing there at the bottom. You can see half of the text on the screen, half of the text outside of the screen. And the reason why we see both is that we both have, what were they? Cancel and OK. That's what we see here. That's CAN, and you can see that's curve there. That is likely the curve for OK. In GammaRay, when you look at this parent-child relationship tree up here, it's actually useful to notice that, hey, there are a bunch of exclamation marks here, and the exclamation mark says, you know what? If you look at, I cannot move. Your eyes need to walk down to the bottom of this dialog where it says, item is visible, but partially out of view. It has been shown, but it's partly out of view. And this one says, item is visible, but out of view, and item has a size of 0. That is my border image that has a size of 0. And similar for my button up here, it also says, item has size of 0. Let's just verify whether it's actually true. So we can look at the width over here. The width is 88. That's not 0. So let's put our hope for height. So height is 36. That's not 0 either. Why did you say that then? Oh, sorry. My fingers must have slipped and hit the label. The button up here, let's just do that again. There you can see height 0 and width 0. Sanity restored. That's nice, isn't it? All right, let's go back to our example now. Just close down GammaRay here. Close down the application. Find my button and get those two back in. Sometimes you get one of them right and the other is not right. So let's imagine that I forgot the implicit width. Let's run it again and see what it looks like now. Two of the buttons actually works, the open and close. Why is that? Let's go and look at the source code. The main open and close was up here. There I explicit specify the width. So when I explicit specify width, I do not need the implicit width anymore. The implicit width, as the name indicates, the width that should be used if no other has been specified. But I actually specified width and height, so that button works just fine. And if I all the time, when I was using my button here, if I all the time would be specifying a width, then I don't need an implicit width, but I'm trying to create a component that can stand in a layout without me explicit setting its size from where I'm using it. The last change I'll do to this application here is that I will make the topmost component not have a correct width. It will actually be width 0 because there's no implicit width specified, but one of its child component will actually have a reasonable width, and then we'll see what happens there. So let's undo the implicit height here and comment out the implicit width. And let's see, we need to go down here. The anchoring, it shouldn't be anchoring anymore. Instead, I should specify a width. And the width should be the label dot width plus, let's say, underscore margin. Let's run this and see what works. What you'll notice is that the button actually looks like it's working now, in some situation at least. We have this button up here that looks properly. But when the button is taking part of some layouting mechanism, so if this is taking part of anchoring or something else, then the anchor will ask the button, how wide are you? The button will say, hey, I am exactly 0 pixels wide. And then it will say, okay, 0 pixels, that means that the next element, I can put that at the same column where you are staying. And then, as a consequence of that, my button will be standing underneath that red rectangle that we have here. And let me just make a small change to the code here so you can actually see that it's standing underneath that. So I need to go to my main, I need to find that button, that rectangle sit here, the button is underneath, let's put the button up on top of it, so set :1, :1. Now we run it again, and you can see now I just took the button and pulled it up on top of the red rectangle, but you can see that they are aligned at column 0 of the blue rectangle. The button looks like it's okay, and the reason why it does that, yeah, I just gave you a chance to remember yourself. I am not clipping. So I am allowed to paint outside of my area, outside of my parent. And that's exactly what I do. I got this rectangle here that I specified a correct size myself. The text inside it is just anchor fill parent, so that looks good too. But if we go to GammaRay, final time here, you will indeed notice we can find that rectangle. I'll just search for rectangle. There's my rectangle here. Oh, that was the big one. There's the small one. And I'll zoom out a bit. You will notice that the rectangle's x coordinate, well, as we know, x is 0, and the button that is standing next to it, we already can see the error symbol here saying item is 0 in width, but still, let's just validate here. Its width is 0 pixel. So obviously it will look right, but it will not work with the anchor layout. And if you look at the background here, it does have a proper width, so that is why it doesn't look right. And you can see the red indication here of where is that element. That's really it for this episode here. It was a long episode, I admit, but I hope that it gave you some insight. And I'll try to summarize just in a few words on what you need to remember. So, rule number 1, always when you want a component that should be able to display itself, you need to give it implicit width and implicit height. That is when you want a component where it shouldn't be explicit set from outside. So if it goes into a layout manager, for example, when you do those implicit width and implicit height, it's worthwhile to think of it that the implicit width is boiling up from the bottom. So we have something that is part of something bigger, that is part of something bigger again, and that is the implicit width and height that you do. Then whenever the surrounding, whoever is using this component, is interacting with the component, they might go and say, hey, your width should be, and your height should be, and then it needs to dribble down. So implicit width, implicit height is bottom up, and the width and the height should be set top down. If you follow that rule, and it's not a difficult rule to remember, but it's difficult to think that rule up by yourself once you're learning all of QML2. So, well, you're welcome. And then, of course, GammaRay. Do not forget that you have this tool. It is a super tool for actually introspecting your application and figure out what is really going on. That's it for this episode. In the next episode, we will see something that we already have seen many times, but I'll just put a few words to it. Namely, how do you create local variables in your QML element? Until then, have a great time.